So it's time to start. So welcome to the annual Colloquium on Language Teaching. As we have done now for the last 15 years, we're gathering today as language educators to connect and learn from each other. This year, although things are not like they normally are, we're still excited to share this colloquium virtually. And we look forward to a return to our normal colloquium on the UNO campus next year. So before we continue, we would like to take this opportunity to show our respect in recognizing that the city of Omaha stands on the traditional treaty lands of the Omaha and Otoe, Missouri tribal nations. We also wish to recognize and show respect to the 3 other federally recognized tribal nations that reside in the state of Nebraska, including the Ponca tribe of Nebraska, the Winnebago tribe of Nebraska, and Santee Sioux tribe of Nebraska. It is now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Florencia Henshaw. Florencia Henshaw has a PhD in second language acquisition and teacher education from the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, where she is now Director of Advanced Spanish. She has taught multiple undergraduate and graduate courses, including online courses. Dr. Henshaw has published and presented widely on key issues in language teaching, such as technology integration, heritage language instruction, and research-based pedagogical practices, both at national and international conferences. She has been an invited speaker at prominent institutions, including Harvard and Yale. Dr. Henshaw is also a certified ACTFL oral proficiency interview tester, an AP Spanish language and culture reader, an AAPPL rater, the author of 2 Spanish textbooks, an editorial board member of the Free Language and Technology magazine, and a member of the board of directors of the American Association of Teachers of Spanish and Portuguese. In 2018, she received the Excellence in Language Instruction Award within the School of Literatures, Cultures, and Linguistics. And in 2019, she was the recipient of the Academic Professional Award within the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. Her upcoming book, Common Ground, Second Language Acquisition Theory Goes to the Classroom, aims to help educators visualize how to put principles into action. Now, before turning the time over to Dr. Henshaw, we invite the audience. If you have questions during the presentation, you may enter them in the chat feature in Zoom, and please direct them to the 2 co-hosts for this session, who are Tara Toscano and David Foshi. During the Q&A, they will facilitate your questions and comments to Dr. Henshaw. Now, please join me in welcoming to UNO, Dr. Henshaw. Virtual clapping.
Virtual welcome. Yes, absolutely. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Cecilia, for such a nice introduction. Thank you for the invitation, for being part of this event. I am honored. I am excited. I think this is an important event to be helping language teachers, right, in their professional development. I'm all for that. Okay, so let me share my screen, make sure that everybody can see it. We're good? Okay. So, so as Cecilia mentioned, so I am the Director of Advanced Spanish at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. One of the things that I do is teach the so-called methods course, right? So the course that our students take, and we talk about second language acquisition and different approaches and things like that. So I'm always reflecting a lot on research, on pedagogy, on what we're doing in the classroom and how to make sense of it all. So my presentation today is separating facts from fads, research-informed pedagogy to foster proficiency development. And as I started to plan my presentation for today, I realized that I was trying to accomplish mainly the following 4 goals: confront contradictions, clear confusion, challenge conformity, and champion change. And these 4 sections are what guides my presentation today. So Let's start with some contradictions and confront them. It is no secret that there's been a lot of pendulum swings when it comes to language teaching and teaching approaches, and even theoretical approaches, right? So we have, just as an example that probably we can all relate, or that we all heard, right? So the extreme of error correction is helpful, and then the other pendulum swing, right? The rejection of that, and just say that error correction is harmful, right? So now we avoid it altogether. We have crashing with all you need is input, and then comes the rejection of that with not enough, we need push output, right? And then we have the extreme of no grammar ever, grammar is bad, and then the rejection of that to no, let's do grammar, explicit instruction works. And more recently, although it is not exclusive to recently, but we do see it recently, is the extreme of simplified input and the rejection in a way of that, to say that's too fake, we need authentic resources, right? So everybody is migrating to as much authenticity as possible. And so what do we do, right? So they tell me to do one thing, they tell me to do the other thing. And what I notice, at least, is a pattern of rejection to the extreme. And the opposite of what is not working is not necessarily the solution, but it seems that we are operating under that assumption, right? So what doesn't work, we find the opposite of it in hopes that that will work. So behind many of these swings, there's research, right? If you hear both camps, they will tell you that there's research, they will cite research. And usually it begins with research shows. And let me stop you right there. And my first question is, what research? Because the first thing we need to question is the fact that published research is inevitably biased. I'm not saying it, this is somebody's fault, right? But this is something that we need to understand. Not everything that should get published is published. And we can debate whether everything that gets published should be published. That's probably a conversation, bigger conversation for another day. But at least I think teachers should understand a little bit that published research is inevitably biased. And then you tell me research shows. So what does research show? Let's talk about it. So research essentially shows our own interpretation of the data. Stacy Johnson talked about mental models in a talk recently, and this resonates with that because we all apply our own mental models, what we want the data to show us, what we're expecting the data to show us, what we think the data is going to show us. And that influences our interpretation of the results and the conclusions that we draw from it. So we could be looking at the same set of data and arrive at different conclusions, or at least arrive at different implications of that data. It's also very common when people want to justify approaches based on research to say XYZ is beneficial. Right? So the data shows that XYZ is beneficial. And I always ask, beneficial for what? We cannot stop at beneficial. We need to understand what we are measuring. We need to understand what we are claiming based on that. And unfortunately, sometimes we don't spend enough time questioning what we're measuring and what we're claiming, and we rush to extrapolate, right? So we want implications and we want them now. We read the abstract of a paper and immediately we want to see, how do I apply that in my classroom, right? And it's a little bit risky to rush so much. And you might be wondering, but wait a minute, the title of your talk says research informed. Hey, I want my money back. No. So what do I mean by research informed? I do not mean a summary of research findings. I do not mean knowing the latest trends in research. What I mean is perhaps we need to be aware of what research shows and how to understand what research shows. Being aware of what it has not shown yet. There are many things we don't know yet, and that's okay. And being aware of what it maybe cannot show? So for example, one big question out there is, can research really capture evidence of acquisition? And it all depends on how we define acquisition, but that is a big question, because a lot of what we're measuring sometimes is performance, right? Is skills, right? Is what the learners are doing with the language. But how do we know the mental representation, right? The acquisition, how do we access that? And yes, we can engage maybe in the Q&A whether that is possible or not. So when I think of research informed, I think more in terms of being informed about research, right? To have a critical approach to results and to claims. And again, not to quote Stacy Johnson too much, but yeah, she talked about what do we mean by critical. And I don't mean to criticize. I don't mean to just simply pinpoint all of the flaws. What I mean is that we need to challenge, we need to question, we need to reflect on it, try to make sense of it, rather than simply accepting it or simply rejecting it. So some consequences of these contradictions that we see, to me, are evident in methods courses, or the so-called methods courses. And the reason why the S is bold is on purpose. That is because a lot of the times their methods is in plural. And what ends up happening many times, not just in graduate courses, but also, courses for teacher candidates, what I see is that they're being presented with a lot of contradictory research findings, right? We want to show everybody's point of view. Or we want to show many different methods and approaches, which sometimes seem to be based on contradictory theoretical underpinnings. And so to me, one of the consequences of that is confusion, is just uncertainty, not quite sure to know who to believe. And what happens with that is that educators then end up making decisions based on their own experiences as language learners, based on their own personal beliefs, based on their students' expectations, because it feels perhaps more tangible than this confusion between so many different research findings. So what can we do to narrow the chasm between the research, which sometimes can be contradictory, and the reality of the classroom? In my opinion, merely increasing access to research is not the solution. So the issue is not that, well, teachers just need to read more research. To me, that doesn't solve the problem. We have a problem of access to research, yes. And again, conversation for another day. But simply telling teachers, oh, look at this study and let me summarize it for you. There you go, now you know the research, is not enough, right? To me, what we should be doing in language teacher education is focusing on the common ground as opposed to the contrast between all of these approaches, between all of these theories, all of these methods, right? And sometimes there is more common ground than we think. That, to me, to focus on what can we all, or most of us, agree on, is a solid foundation for language educators to then make decisions. So the big question, right? What can we agree on? Well, we can probably agree that input is necessary. If there's one thing that just about everybody in SLA will tell you, okay, yeah, I agree with that, is input is necessary. Is that it? Okay, thank you. Well, thank you for coming to my talk. Let's do some questions. Okay, no, there's gotta be more that we can agree on, right? But what do we mean by input is necessary, right? Let's dissect that a little bit more. And perhaps the next statement, not everybody might agree on. Robert de Keyser might not agree on, but essentially acquisition is what happens to you while you're busy understanding messages, right? So we process the input for meaning first. Everybody knows that. And then we start building our system based on that. But it is not conscious, right? So it's not that you can wake up one day and say, today I'm going to be acquiring gender agreement. It just doesn't work that way. So this is why I say it happens to you while you're busy understanding messages. It's not something you can consciously control. Some implications to consider if we agree on that then is, first, let's not sacrifice comprehensibility for authenticity. So authentic materials are great, don't get me wrong, but to me, there is a problem if we become so obsessed with authentic materials that we are spending so much time to get students to understand one text, as opposed to have them engage with more language that they can actually comprehend. And of course, we know that for some learners, authentic resources might be incredibly frustrating, right? Like even when you help them, they still get frustrated that they're not understanding it on their own. So we need a balance. And let's give priority to understanding content over understanding rules. So if we agree that acquisition is what happens to you while you're busy understanding messages, then that's what we should be focusing on, as opposed to understanding how the language works. So all you need is input. Is that it? And again, that's one of those statements that for me needs a little bit of an addendum, right? For what, right? Is sufficient for what? So input and output play different roles. I don't like the whole team output and team input, right? And we have to take sides. There's no reason to take sides. They both play roles in language acquisition and development. Input essentially builds the system, and output helps with accessing the system. Both things are things we want. We want our students to have a system that they can then access, right? And then they can access with more fluency as time goes by. So both input and output play roles. And hopefully we can also agree that having a solid grasp on these fundamental aspects of language acquisition is essential to clear some of the confusion surrounding certain practices and beliefs. And a lot of what I just said is going to come back to the next section when I talk about some of the confusion around some common practices and beliefs. So I invite everybody, including myself, to re-examine some of our beliefs. So one thing I hear very often is we can learn our second language the same way we learned our first language, right? Essentially saying that first language acquisition and second language acquisition are identical, right? That we can do the same thing we did with babies, we can do it with our students in the classroom. And while I agree that the basic roles of input and output are the same, meaning input is still building the system, output is still helping with accessing the system. That is true. I think that we cannot take second language acquisition as, especially instructed second language acquisition, as something that happens in a vacuum, right? What about context? What about all of the restrictions that we have in an institutional education context? What about the age of our learners? What about the fact that our learners already have a linguistic system in place? I think that those are all things that we need to consider before we rush to the conclusion that L1 and L2 acquisition are the same. At the same time, I do think that we need to be cautious about simplifying L1 acquisition. And this is how we got ALM in a way, right? The audiolingualism. Babies don't acquire by listening and repeating. That's just not how we acquire a language. It's also, I think, to say that output has no role in first language acquisition is a little bit dangerous, right? And that's how we ended up with just listen and repeat. But we know that that doesn't get us very far. Okay, another common practice and belief that I hear a lot is that it takes a lot of practice. It's like riding a bike. And this is where a lot of second language acquisition experts say, no, learning a language is unlike learning anything else. I don't know if Stacey Johnson is in the audience, but I know that she doesn't like it when people say that. I understand why she doesn't like it when people say that, but there's a reason. I think there's an important reason why we want to differentiate acquiring a language or developing the communicative skills with riding a bike. And the reason for it is probably because of that word practice. Typically, when we think of practice, we think of skill building, right? Riding a bike, learning to dance, etc. And skill building. skill building, when we're thinking of language, then we usually think of output, right? Because output helps us with retrieving that information, right? And there's skill in that, right? In writing and speaking, right? There's skill. But here's the catch. There's no input, then there's no output, right? Output cannot exist without input. And so the risk with thinking that it takes a lot of practice is that we may end up favoring a lot more output than input in our classes. And then we end up with this imbalance, because if there's not enough input, there's not going to be a whole lot of output. We need to remember that output does not build the system. So we need definitely a lot of input to build the system. And also, learning about the language doesn't build a system either. And this is why PPP, which is present, practice, produce, is particularly problematic, right? So we have the present, which is learning about the language. We know that doesn't build a system. We have the practice. Again, the problem is, and we're focusing a lot on just skill building. And then we have the produce output, right? So it feels like there's a lot of, let me explain to you how it is, now you do it. And if you've ever taught languages, you know that's not how it works, right? You can just tell learners, this is how it works. Okay, now you say something, and it just doesn't work that way. Something else we need to re-examine is the role of grammar, right? And teaching grammar. And this statement here is something that I used to believe, I admit it. So teaching grammar rules is a shortcut to speed up acquisition. The reality is that we might actually be slowing things down for a number of reasons. So first, some research does show, which makes sense, that if we lead with the grammar rule, we lead with the explicit information, the knowledge, we might decrease fluency, right? Because as we are speaking, we start questioning everything that we are saying. Did I conjugate that verb right? Wait, no, was there an estar? What do I need here? Right? As opposed to just letting it flow. And we might be slowing things down because if we're spending too much time teaching the grammar rules, as opposed to engaging with content, engaging with input, then again, we are favoring other things as opposed to engaging with the language, with meaning. And something that probably every teacher can agree on, knowing the rule doesn't mean that you can use it. A lot of our learners might be able to tell us all of the uses of present and perfect, but that doesn't translate to actual language, accurate language use. And even if you think, well, but knowing the rule, explicit knowledge might help, for example, when they are editing their composition, right? When they're monitoring their production. Well, yeah, I can agree with that, but there's the fine print, which is that we still don't know why that explicit knowledge gets used sometimes, but not other times, even when we are just doing the exact same task. And the experts will agree with that. Even people who value feedback, corrective feedback in writing, they will admit that, is that even if they have that explicit knowledge, even if they know the rule, that doesn't mean they're going to apply it every single time that they're monitoring their production. And I don't know that I need to convince you on this, but there's absolutely no correlation between proficiency levels and knowing rules. You can be an advanced and superior speaker of a language and not be able to articulate any of the rules of the language. Okay, something else to consider. Maybe you're like, okay, but teaching the rule, yeah, explicit grammar, got it, I don't do that. How about discovering the rule, right? And I've heard this a lot too, right? That letting learners to discover the rules, to do more inductive approaches, to be discussing it. Let's look at this paragraph. What do you notice here, right? That is supposed to be better than teaching it. But again, knowing the rule doesn't mean you can use it. So if at the end, the whole point is to discover a rule, what are we accomplishing with that if it doesn't mean that you can use it? And then on a more practical level, inductive approaches are quite time consuming, right? There's a lot of discussion that goes on to finding the right input, to dissecting it, to test different hypotheses, right? And the question is it the best use of our time, right? Should we then perhaps be engaging with more input and meaningful communication as opposed to be dissecting the language and talking about language? And the grammar of a language is incredibly, incredibly complex. Most likely, even if you spend an entire class trying to discover a rule of when to use ser and estar, which could take a while if you know Spanish. Instead of doing that, the result of doing that most likely is going to be a simplification, right? It's going to be maybe just a generalization. Well, I guess it's with adjectives and this is with this. And eventually, sooner or later, they will encounter exceptions. They will encounter things that make them show that that rule doesn't work. And so was it worth it? Was it worth our time, right? And I keep going back to that. In the last one that I want to examine, the last belief that I want to examine is the saying that everybody learns differently. And for some students, mechanical drills are beneficial. And so the first thing that I will probably say is that nobody's denying individual differences. There are indeed individual differences, and nobody is denying that. But again, beneficial for what, right? I'm missing the for what. Sometimes we're too quick to say, no, they're not, they're bad, just bad, no, not beneficial. Did we hear the whole sentence? Beneficial for what? If you are trying to get students to do really well on a discrete point test, oh yeah, mechanical drills are probably beneficial for that, right? Let's just drill it in, get them memorized, and then they know how to fill in those blanks. Okay. But if we are thinking that they're beneficial for acquiring the language, we know that's not true. And why? Because acquiring a language requires developing mental representation from the input, from meaning. Acquiring a language is essentially making for meaning connections, and mechanical drills by definition involve zero meaning. You don't actually have to understand the language. Is it beneficial for developing communicative ability? Again, not quite. If communication involves meaning, mechanical drills, again, do not focus on meaning, right? So we just have to always keep in mind of the for what, right? What are we trying to do? What is our goal? So all of these contradictions, all of this confusion, it's only natural that it makes us crave standards, guidelines, pillars, tenets, right? We crave clarity and direction when we are faced with too many contradictions or with too much confusion. We don't know what to do. We need somebody or something to tell us to tell us the way, right? To lead the way. The question is, who leads the way? And do we just follow or not? And I think that's where the risk of conformity seeps in. So to me, when it comes to language teaching, conformity is what happens when our approach becomes defined by what others do. So essentially, we emulate what and how to teach because, you know, a colleague is telling you this is working great. But can we articulate why? Are we understanding why we're teaching that way? I think it's human to want to belong, to want to connect with like-minded people, to want to be part of a community. And sometimes these communities have labels, right? And so we identify with TBLT, or we identify with CI, comprehensible input. We identify with TPRS, or we assess with IPAs. And what happens is then we start following these guidelines, sometimes without questioning them too much, right? It feels like, but that's just how you do it. If you're going to do an IPA, this is how you do it. And my favorite label, communicative, right? Which at this point, what does that mean? Right? Because I think everybody's claiming to be communicative. And I think it's perfectly natural, normal to want to belong, to want to label, because it's part of our identity, right? Our identity is what groups we identify with and we don't identify with. But I also think it's healthy to question, to challenge, to reflect. And we need to question this conformity, right? Do we have a solid understanding of merits and shortcomings of all of these labels rather than accepting them blindly and following to the letter? I think it's healthy to question and to want to make sense of it. And do we feel comfortable speaking up? Because sometimes we might fear being admonished, being cast away. If we point out something that we don't agree with, something that we're grappling with, we're not understanding why they're telling us to do something a particular way. I'll give you one specific example related to IPAs. When you look at an IPA rubric, I have a reaction to the wording of the rubric to say exceeds expectations, and for exceeds expectations to mean 100%. If I were a student, I would want to get 100% if I'm performing at level, meaning I am meeting the expectations of my teacher in how she wants me to perform. And so I challenge that, I question that, right? So do we all have to keep saying exceeds expectations? Could it be another alternative? A side effect of conformity, I'm not saying everybody who conforms also shows contempt, but I do think that is a side effect that we need to be aware of, and it is contempt, meaning we rush to rejection, right? We rush to say, oh no, but that's wrong. We rush to judgment. If somebody asks, you know, a fun way of conjugating verbs, we may rush to judge them, right? Like they don't know SLA. And we rush to give advice without context. I see this a lot in social media, and I know that social media may not be the best forum for dialogue, but it's a way that a lot of teachers connect, and I think it has a lot of value. But we need to be careful with rushing to give advice without understanding the full context. So many times we see questions such as, does anybody have a good activity to practice direct object pronouns? And so instead of understanding why the person is asking for it, what their assessment practices are, what their objectives are, what their context is, we simply rush to give the advice of, you shouldn't be teaching explicitly, that doesn't do anything, your students are not ready for it. We just rush to give advice without context. I think that's dangerous. Why? Because I think it is counterproductive to change. When we feel that our identity has been attacked or questioned, right? When we feel somebody telling us that we're not teaching the right way, I think instead of wanting to engage in dialogue, the most natural reaction, or perhaps the most frequent reaction, is simply to avoid, right? To not want to engage with that person because we feel attacked. So what's more useful, more productive, is to interrogate the practice, not the person. And I always, when I'm interrogating my own practices, what I do, even one activity, I always go back to this question: are students able and compelled to understand and express meaning? If my answer is no, that means that I need to rethink something about that particular activity or what I'm planning to do in class. So let's look at some common things that I've seen that we've all done in language classrooms. So the first one I call, what color is my jacket? In Argentina, we have an expression very similar, which is, ¿de qué color es el caballo blanco de San Martín? Just like, what color is the white horse of San Martín, right? So if you're already asking me what color, you're telling me the white horse, right? That is essentially a obvious question, right? With an obvious answer. And it's a pointless question, right? It feels pointless. What color is my jacket? Well, I just put it on, I can probably see it, right? So I'm not asking because I am honestly wanting to know what color is my jacket. I'm asking because it's a display question. I want you to practice using colors, right? The problem is that enough to compel a student to understand and express meaning? There's meaning involved. I have to understand the question. Do I feel compelled, like truly motivated to tell you something? Probably not, because I know that you already know the answer. So display questions, they may have a role, very, very limited role. I understand, maybe to check for comprehension real quick, but it cannot be the main way we are communicating in the classroom. And in fact, may not be actual communication. Another practice, we've all done it, write 100 words on this topic, or 200 words, 150 words, right? You give them the prompt, you give them the topic, the number of words, go and write. So again, the problem that I see there is, who's the audience and what is the purpose? Why am I compelled to tell you something, right? What is the audience going to be doing with this information, right? And so the student might not be entirely compelled or motivated to express meaning. Another thing that I still see very common in many classrooms, right? So listen to a song, fill in the blanks with the words that you hear. Songs are great, don't get me wrong. I think that there's a lot of value to songs that go beyond language acquisition. But it just, if we're trying to do is just for language development, maybe all we're doing is developing some ear training, right? So to be able to recognize sounds. But when you think about it, there's really not a whole lot of meaning involved. Once you start recognizing sounds, you can probably transcribe, but you didn't really need to understand anything, right? So whether you are able and compelled to understand this activity just by itself, it doesn't do it, right? We cannot answer that question. So as we interrogate our practices, one thing that comes into play is change, right? Many times we do need to make some changes. So why would we want to change? Change is uncomfortable. Change is a lot of work. Change requires us to get out of our comfort zone. And I think that there are very valid reasons to push for change. So the first one would be empowerment, right? So instead of just following what somebody else does, instead of not being quite sure why you do things, but I guess you're doing it because everybody else is doing it, or you've done it for many years, I think you feel empowered to be making your own decisions and enacting change for yourself. I think it's one way of just minimizing that self-doubt if you're not quite sure why you're doing things. And actually now you do know how to do things. Clarity, very important, not just for yourself, right? That you have clear goals, that you are meeting your goals, for the students. Right? A lot of the times our practices send mixed messages to our students. For example, oh yeah, I want you to take risks with the language, but then the rubric punishes you if you say something wrong, right? But you took a risk with the language, so why am I losing points? So it's just to gain more clarity, avoid all of these mixed messages. I think it leads to more satisfaction on everyone's part. You're going to feel more satisfied that you know what you're doing, that you feel secure and confident in what you're doing. But also the students are going to be more satisfied that they understand your goals, they understand how you're getting them there. There's less chagrin, there's less frustration of failing, less frustration of being judged by others, right? So change is important and is necessary. It's a lot of work. It's uncomfortable work, but it's good. So what do we change? And what do we do to change? So there's a lot of questions that we need to ask ourselves. And I do mean ourselves. I don't mean just point to others and say, do you have communicative goals? Do you know what you're doing? A lot of times we need to look at ourselves, right? And ask ourselves these questions almost continuously, right? Do we have clear communicative goals? Do we know where we're going? Do we know what we want the students to do? Do our practices serve our goals? Right? So maybe, yeah, I want them to be able to talk. I want them to do this. I got proficiency guidelines. I'm good. Okay, but now what I'm doing in class, is that adequately preparing them to meet that goal? Do we have realistic expectations in terms of what learners can do with the language? And this is always a work in progress, right? Always to keep adjusting the expectations a little bit, a little bit, a little bit. Why? Because we need to understand and accept the unique and frustrating nature of language acquisition and development. We would love it to be like, I'm showing you something, you're being exposed, you read this text, so now you should be able to produce a similar text, and it doesn't work that way. Not everything from the input becomes intake, right? Not everything from the input is processed. And how do we know what gets and doesn't get, right? It is just very unique and a very frustrating process, let's be honest. And I think another question we need to ask ourselves and keep in mind and keep reflecting on it continuously is our role as language educators. And the reason why I think it's so important is because what we do in class and the goals we set are in a way tied to how we view our role in class. So to me, our role as language educators is to provide a purpose for communicating. What information or content is being conveyed? What will others do with that information? As an educator, that's what I need to keep checking. That's what I need to keep providing my learners. My role is not to control language use. It's not to say this is right, this is wrong. It's not to try to modify the language that some of the learners might bring with them. My role is also not to control language access, meaning it's not my role to just give them the vocab list and say, these are the only words that you can use. Or it's not my role to say, only listen to me. Don't worry about everybody else. I am the source of input. I'm all that you need. That's not my role, right? So language can be accessed elsewhere. And to me, it's fantastic when the learners want to access language elsewhere. So the big question, how do we change? Change is not easy. And then there's not like one magic recipe for change. Although I do have to tell you, Claudia Fernandez, I think she's in the audience today. She has a fantastic article in the Language Educator about addressing change in language programs. So some of the things, these are my own reflections, and they do match some of Claudia's too. The first one is start with assessment, actually. I think that once you change your goal and how you measure your goal, your test, your assessment, a lot of the other things have to fall into place. What I see very often is that well-intended teachers change what happens in the classroom, and they say, oh, I want to be more communicative. Great. But the test stays the same. And so what happens? Everybody gets frustrated. They didn't know how to conjugate the verb. They did so poorly that they didn't study, right? If we don't change the test, we're not going to change the teaching. And start small. Don't start with an entire course. Don't start with every single assessment. Sometimes it could be the wording in your rubrics. Take a second look at the wording in your rubrics. Start with yourself. Do you need others? Absolutely. But you need to start with yourself, because otherwise it feels like finger pointing, right? So you do need to start with yourself and the changes that you can make. You can see how those changes worked, make adjustments, maybe then start involving others. As Claudia said, you need allies. You don't need enemies. And when you involve others, start with your common ground, right? So don't start with, you believe this, I believe this, right? We are so different. Don't start pointing out the differences. Start with what you both believe in. And the common ground can be theoretical beliefs, but it could also be common goals, right? Maybe you both want the students to be able to communicate, right? So how do we get there? You need to start with common ground with others, including students, maybe admins, colleagues, right? Start with common ground. So thank you very much. I think we have some time for questions or comments. I would love to hear your thoughts. I also understand if some of the things I said made you uncomfortable, if they were unpopular opinions, it's just food for thought. It's just to get the wheels going. That's my intention.
Thank you for that, Florencia. That was wonderful. So I think we'll transition now to the Q&A. We have some questions in the chat. First, I wanted to address what will be made available after today I believe Florencia will be posting, the slides will be made available on her website for everyone to access. And then also MALT will be posting by the end of the month a recording of this presentation that will be available for streaming. And I'll add the link here to the chat so everyone has it. And also anyone who is participating today, once that's made available, will receive an email with a link. So we're going to go ahead and move to the Q&A. I think David is actually going to ask our first question here.
All right, thank you very much, Tara, and thank you for a wonderful presentation. Our first question is from Paulino Brenner, and it goes, besides teachers reading the research, where are conversations between teachers and researchers happening? Conversations about the implications to teaching.
I could not catch the last part. Your microphone was breaking up. I'm sorry. I did understand the first part about where conversations take place.
Yeah, that's basically the question. Sorry, it ends by saying conversations about the implications to teaching.
Oh, about the implications to teachers. I think that is a great question. I do think that perhaps this is one thing that is still a work in progress, right? It's still evolving. And that is that we seem to have, the academic conferences and then the teaching conferences, and sometimes there's not a lot of dialogue. I do think that a lot of the events like this one can help to bridge those two worlds. I do think that a lot of the conversations that are happening in social media are also useful. I think it's making experts more accessible to teachers to be able to ask questions. I do think that we perhaps need to also rethink professional development and how that happens, right? So doing things like Q&A, more interactive sessions where the teachers can ask the questions that they're wondering, right? And then a panel of experts, so it's not just one voice, can perhaps address it from different viewpoints. That might help, right? And share different resources. I think that that's a start. Change is slow, right? Like there's not a one place where they can go and find all the answers or figure out everything they need for their teaching. I think that since our context is so different, we need to take that into account. So at the very least, I do think that we should all agree on the basics, right? On the fundamentals, and then go from there.
Wonderful. And I have another question here from Jamie Honke. She states, one of the challenges we face in the K through 12 system in many schools is that student teachers leave methods courses and are in schools with curriculum guides that argue against the what we can agree on slide. They're very rule-based conjugations and vocabulary lists. And when teachers who have researched language acquisition theory attempt to push back, they are told this is how we have always done it. So how can we as a world language education community change that dynamic?
Oh, that is a fantastic question. And it is absolutely the reality, but it is not everyone's reality. I am seeing more and more students, at least the ones that are pursuing the teaching license here, that are in schools where they are proficiency based, where they're doing integrated performance assessments, where they're changing things slowly but surely. And so I do think that change is happening, but it's true that a lot of the times they have this conflict, right, of somebody's telling me something in the classroom, right, in my courses, and then I go to the reality and my cooperative teacher is saying, no, that's not how we do it, right? I think that is probably part of the reality that in a way we need to accept. I don't think that we should just be telling that teacher, you're doing everything wrong, don't work with my student, right? Like, I don't think that helps. I think it's more of a teachable moment for the student teacher to then be reflecting on what works and what doesn't. And hopefully that student teacher in the future can start enacting change. At least that's what I've seen with my students, the ones that that have done the teaching license and that are now teaching in high schools. and you know, they may not change everything on day one, but they push for change gradually, right? They realize the things that are not working, that how can we make the assessments better? And change is slow, but it does happen.
All right, we have, thank you very much. We have several questions here. I'm trying to see. This question is from Michael Brigante. If it is not our role to control access, how do you feel about students using Google Translate and its implication of language development? Are students cheating the process?
Oh goodness, I have an article about Google Translate. So I'll just post the link and you can go read my thoughts. They would probably be too long to list in 10 minutes. No, Google Translate does not contribute to acquisition. I mean, okay, unpopular opinion maybe. I just don't think that just copy pasting is doing much to develop the system. That's not what I meant, right? That's not what I meant by controlling access. What I meant by it is in terms of, for example, students that are, some of the practices I've seen, like students getting penalized because they used a word that wasn't the word in the vocab list, right? That's what I mean by controlling access. I didn't mean Google Translate can just come in, just copy from Google Translate and it's all good. No. I meant in terms of trying to put language in a box. I don't know if that makes more sense, but I'm happy to share the link to the Google Translate article so you can understand where I'm coming from. But no, I don't allow it. And it's not a matter of I'm going to punish you, if you will. I just change things. And it's more of a making the students understand why it's not helping them. But, you know, I also respect my colleagues who think that there could be a place for Google Translate, especially in more advanced classes. And yes, then I'm willing to hear. What I think what I'm struggling to understand is how Google Translate can lead to acquisition or communicative ability. I just don't see it yet. I'm not convinced of that.
So the next question is from Rachel Connolly. Is there a certain amount of input that is recommended before expecting students to produce output?
Oh my goodness, that is a question that we actually have in our book. Mary's Hawkins and I are writing an SLA book, The Common Ground. And that is one question we absolutely have there because everybody wonders the same thing. There's no formula. No, there's not like, okay, this has been enough input, now we do output. And the reason why there's no formula is because a lot of the times the students start producing language because it's natural, normal, human, right? Before we tell them to produce language. So we need to let go a little bit of that control of don't talk, okay, now talk, right? And I don't mean in Zoom where you turn on and off microphones, right? But like just in the classroom, right? I think that we need to let the language development happen at its own pace. We cannot control it. And for some students, it's going to be different. I think that, of course, the more input, the more engagement with language, the better. The more exposure they have to the same words, to the same forms, the better, yes. But I think it would be wrong of me to say you need 5 activities of this and 2 of these. It's just, it doesn't work that way.
All right, we have a question here from David Harper. It sounded like you were suggesting a communicative classroom needs a communicative assessment. What might that look like?
Oh, it's a good question. So I think IPAs, integrated performance assessments, are one option. They're not the only option, but they're certainly one option. I think approaches in terms of proficiency based, so understanding and integrated performance assessment are very much linked to proficiency. But understanding what have we been doing in class in terms of communication, not what chapter we have covered, right? But what communicative tasks we have been doing, and then can you do it relatively unassisted now, right? So I think that's I'm summarizing IPAs very, very rushly here, but I also did a talk on IPAs, and I do think they're great. I think that it's just a matter of adapting it to your context, and they do present some challenges. But for example, so some of the things I do, even in courses where I cannot modify them entirely to be, you know, IPA to the letter, some of the things that I do is, for example, I meet with the students and I do a very informal interview as a conversation, right? And so I help them because I know as a teacher, right, what they can handle if they didn't understand how to rephrase, how to use a cognate, how to, and yes, I am OPI trained, so I'm already used to like different question techniques, right? So I understand that that may not come natural to everybody, but it is great training if you can do it. I think there's a lot that we can apply to our classroom, and you can tell what students are doing, right? And so the text type that they're producing, are they just giving me words? Are they trying to give me sentences? Can they give me some variety, right? Like all of the things that we take into account to assess proficiency, I take that as my way of assessing. So if I'm aiming for a particular proficiency level and I know that I've prepared them for that proficiency level, anybody who is at that level gets 100, right? Of course, there's a rubric. Not everybody gets 100. But, so I think that there are ways of focusing more on communication, meaning the understanding of a message and then being able to express a message. But I guess that was a very long, convoluted answer to maybe look into IPAs.
Okay, the next question is from Dean Oglesby. So I have a question and a comment also from the attendee. So he said, I understand that students after third year, language students beyond third year actually benefit more from explicit grammar instruction, while those in their first 1 to 2 years benefit more from exposure, high input, high output. There is a capability of nuance of language possible after more years of practice. What are your thoughts on multiple methods of teaching within a level and also multiple methods within a program? And then and then it stated, could you give me an example of an activity that compels students? Oh, sorry, this was another question. Okay. So the question is, what are your thoughts on multiple methods of teaching within a level and multiple methods within a program?
Okay. Okay. The multiple approaches within a program is the norm, I think, right? So within a program, inevitably, you're going to have several instructors and each instructor has their own approach. I think it's important to work with each other to articulate as much as you can, absolutely. But I also think it's inevitable that each one of us does our own spin, even if we tend to follow the same fundamental principles. I tend to go back to principles as opposed to method, approach, and the label, right? I don't want to be labeled, you are CI, I am TPRS, and you are this, and you are that. And I don't want to judge people on that either. I just go back to the basic principles that I outlined, right? So are students able and compelled to understand language? Are students able and compelled to produce language, to express meaning, right? And to me, it's much more crucial that the students are engaging with meaningful content, and that's what guides our courses, or even my course, as opposed to the students should see present tense, or we need to cover 4 chapters, right? So I just go back to that as opposed to, we do CI, so I cannot do this and that, right? So instead of going with the label or the method or saying, we're gonna do CI on Monday and then we're gonna do TBLT on Friday, I mean, that doesn't work either, right? So instead of that, just the whole course, go back to basics, right? Go back to the roles of input and output, go back to communication, right? Being able and compelled to interpret and express meaning.
Oh, can I just like to add, Danae, excuse me for the wrong pronunciation of her name. She just wanted to add as a follow-up that in relation to that question, she would like to see all language methods taken as tools in our toolbox and agrees with you that we do not need to be staunchly in one camp or the other, but constantly reflect on our practices and our student development.
Yeah.
Do we have time for another question, or Cecilia, was that?
Yeah, we do have a couple of minutes.
Okay.
All right, we have a question here from Patrick Laird. Could you give me an example of an activity that compels students to seek meaning and to communicate with purpose? What does that look like in the context of a classroom?
Yes. Buy my book. No, we just, that's exactly all of the examples. And I drove my coworker crazy. The students who have taken methods courses with me, oh, they know that I'm all about so what, right? Because sometimes we focus so much on, but they're practicing, but they're talking, right? Who cares? So what? Who's going to pay attention to this, right? I always go back to that, right? So the being able to understand, being able to produce, well, that is part of how we're preparing them, right? And the level that we're aiming for. But many times we forget about the compelled portion of it. So when it comes to input, Krashen would say they're compelled when something is interesting to you. Of course, I agree, right? So if you're watching, Gran Hotel or any of those TV shows on Netflix and you really want to know what happens next, you're very much compelled to keep understanding. Now, how do we do that when we have a class of 20, 25 students with very different interests? It's close to impossible, right? So the way that I see it, I'm not saying that this reflects Krashen, not saying this reflects Bill Patton, this is me. The way that I see it is, within the activity, am I giving them a clear, concrete goal or purpose for wanting to understand their partner, for wanting to communicate something to their partner? So, and I think this goes back to TBLT, right, to task-based a little bit. So just for example, right, so if, let's say, let me give you this example where it contrasts both. Instead of doing display questions where I'm just showing a picture and asking things like, what color is the ball? What is this? Is it a dog or is it a cat? Well, we're all seeing it. It's a dog. The ball is red, right? I'm not too compelled to want to answer because I know that you know the answer, right? So instead of that, what if we do questions with an image, but our goal is to do some visual analysis, to put all of these pieces together so that we can do a very simple visual analysis of this painting, for example, right? So now there's a bigger goal, there's a bigger purpose to it. There's a purpose for me asking you these questions. It's because we need to put all of that information together so that we can analyze the painting, for example. Or a lot of tasks. So for example, things like decision-making tasks, right? So if I'm giving you a situation, you need to work together with a classmate to come up with a plan for this. Well, the coming up with that plan is what's compelling you to understand what your classmate is suggesting, to want to respond to your classmate to see if you agree or not with that, right? So it's just more about giving them a purpose outside of just practicing a particular form or practicing vocabulary. That's what I mean by compelling learners to understand and want to express meaning. And also this goes back, if you've seen my webinar on discussion forums, I teach a lot of online courses where there's the discussion forums and somebody posts something, and then usually it's just replied it to classmates. Why? Because that's what we do, right? And because that's what I told you to. Instead of that is, how can I compel my learners, give them a purpose to respond? So whether it is somebody's going to describe their favorite place to go on a trip, and then somebody needs to read that and guess where that place is. So now I am interested, compelled, I need to understand in order to do the second part that you're asking me to, which is to respond, right? So that's what I mean by giving them more of a clear purpose or a clear reason to be compelled to communicate.
Excellent, thank you so much. I think now it's time to transition to...
Yes, thank you so much, Florencia. Loved it. Thank you so much. Lots of food for thought.